Imagine standing at the edge of the known world, where the maps of ancient cartographers simply ended with the words, "Here be dragons." Picture a young man barely out of his teens who looked at those empty spaces and saw not warnings, but invitations. Tonight, we follow the footsteps of the most audacious adventurer who ever lived, a king who conquered 3 continents before his 30th birthday, who built cities that still bear his name today, and who died weeping not from defeat, but because he believed there were no more worlds left to conquer. This is the story of Alexander of Macedon, but not as you know him from dusty textbooks or marble statues. This is Alexander the dreamer, the boy who tamed an untamable horse, the student who cut through an impossible knot, the young king who marched his army beyond the edge of every map ever drawn. His is a tale of impossible courage, of friendships forged in fire, of love and betrayal, of gods and mortals walking the same dusty roads toward destiny. Allow your mind to drift back through 23 centuries of swirling time, back to ancient Macedonia, where the air smells of olive groves and the Mediterranean breeze carries whispers of the greatest adventure story ever lived. Here, in this land of rugged mountains and fierce streams, our journey begins. In the shadow of Mount Olympus, where the ancient Greeks believed their gods dwelled among the clouds, there lived a boy whose destiny would stretch across 3 continents. The year was 356 BCE, and in the royal palace of Pella, capital of Macedonia, a child was born who would one day stand at the edge of the known world and weep, not from sorrow, but because there were no more lands left to conquer. Picture, if you will, the marble halls of the Macedonian palace, where young Alexander's footsteps echoed as he ran through corridors adorned with frescoes depicting the exploits of Achilles and Hercules. The boy's hair caught the Mediterranean sunlight streaming through the windows, golden and wild, much like his spirit. His eyes, we're told by ancient historians like Plutarch, were of 2 different colors, one blue, one brown, as if the gods themselves couldn't decide which hue best suited someone destined to bridge 2 worlds. Alexander's mother, Olympias of Epirus, was a woman of fierce devotion and mysterious practices. She worshipped the ancient gods with an intensity that both fascinated and frightened the court. In the quiet hours of evening, when shadows grew long across the palace floors, she would tell her son stories of his divine ancestry. "You are descended from Achilles," she would whisper, her voice soft as silk yet strong as steel. "The blood of heroes flows in your veins." But it was another lineage she spoke of in hushed tones, away from the ears of servants and courtiers. Olympias claimed that Alexander was not merely the son of Philip II of Macedon, but had been conceived through divine intervention. She spoke of dreams and visions, of serpents and eagles, weaving a tapestry of mythology around her son's birth that would follow him throughout his life. The boy absorbed these stories like a sponge absorbs water. In the quiet moments before sleep, young Alexander would lie in his bed and imagine himself racing across the plains of Troy, his sword gleaming in the ancient sun, his war cry echoing across the Hellespont. These weren't merely childhood fantasies, they were rehearsals for a destiny he somehow knew awaited him. His father, Philip II, was a man of different temperament but equal ambition. Where Olympias dealt in mysteries and divine claims, Philip was a pragmatist, a military genius who had transformed Macedonia from a backwater kingdom into the dominant power of Greece. Philip had lost an eye in battle, and the scar that ran down his weathered face told stories of campaigns fought and won across the rugged terrain of the Balkans. Under Philip's watchful gaze, young Alexander learned the arts of war and statecraft. But the boy's education extended far beyond the clash of bronze and iron. At the age of 13, when most children were concerned with games and simple pleasures, Alexander was entrusted to the care of perhaps the greatest mind of the ancient world, Aristotle, the philosopher whose teachings would shape Western thought for millennia to come. Picture the scene: in a grove of trees near the town of Mysa, away from the distractions of court life, the great philosopher and his royal student would walk together in the dappled shade. Aristotle, with his thoughtful demeanor and careful speech, would speak of the nature of courage, of justice, of the proper way to govern men. Alexander, restless and quick to grasp complex ideas, would pepper his teacher with questions that revealed a mind both practical and dreaming. "What makes a man great?" the boy might ask, his feet crunching on the fallen leaves of autumn. Aristotle, stroking his beard as he considered his answer, would speak not only of conquest and glory, but of virtue and wisdom. True greatness, he might say, lies not merely in the ability to command others, but in the mastery of oneself. These conversations, taking place in the peaceful grove while the sun filtered through ancient oak trees, would shape Alexander's understanding of leadership in ways that pure military training never could. Aristotle introduced him to the works of Homer, and Alexander would carry a copy of the Iliad with him throughout his campaigns, keeping it beneath his pillow at night as if the words themselves might whisper strategies into his dreams. But it was not merely intellectual pursuits that occupied the young prince's time. Stories tell us of the day when Alexander first encountered Bucephalus, the magnificent black stallion that would become his most trusted companion. The horse, brought to Philip's court by a Thessalian horse dealer, was considered untrainable, a beautiful but dangerous creature that reared and struck at anyone who approached. The court had gathered to witness what they expected to be another failed attempt to tame the beast. Philip himself stood ready to dismiss the horse as worthless when his 13-year-old son stepped forward. The boy had been watching quietly, and in that patient observation, he had noticed something the adults had missed. "He's afraid of his own shadow," Alexander announced, his young voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. The assembled nobles might have laughed, but there was something in the boy's manner, a quiet confidence, that commanded attention. With movements calm and deliberate, Alexander approached the great stallion. Instead of facing the horse head-on as the trainers had done, he positioned himself so that Bucephalus could not see his shadow. The horse, no longer startled by the dark shape moving at the edge of his vision, grew still. Alexander reached out slowly, his hand gentle but firm, and touched the horse's neck. The moment between boy and stallion stretched like a held breath. Then, with a fluid motion that would have impressed the most seasoned cavalry officer, Alexander swung himself onto Bucephalus's back. Horse and rider moved as one, cantering around the courtyard in perfect harmony while the court watched in amazement. Philip, witnessing this display of intuition and courage, is said to have wept with pride. "My boy," he declared, "you must find a kingdom equal to yourself, for Macedonia is too small for you." Even then, perhaps, father and son both understood that those words carried the weight of prophecy. As the years passed and Alexander grew from boy to young man, his reputation began to spread beyond the borders of Macedonia. At 16, while Philip campaigned in Thrace, Alexander was left to rule as regent, a responsibility that would have overwhelmed most teenagers. But when the Thracian tribe of Mede rose in rebellion, thinking to take advantage of the king's absence, they discovered that Philip's son was no ordinary youth. Alexander didn't merely suppress the rebellion, he demonstrated a strategic mind that combined his father's tactical brilliance with innovations that were uniquely his own. He founded a city on the site of his victory, naming it Alexandropolis, the first of many cities that would bear his name across the ancient world. These early victories revealed something profound about Alexander's character. He was not content merely to defeat his enemies. He sought to understand them, to incorporate their strengths into his own forces, and to win not just their submission but their loyalty. This approach, revolutionary for its time, would become the foundation of his later conquests. In the quiet evenings after these early campaigns, when the young prince sat by firelight planning his next moves, perhaps he remembered his mother's stories of divine ancestry and his teacher's lessons about virtue and wisdom. The boy who had once dreamed of racing across the plains of Troy was becoming a man who might actually do so. The stage was set for greatness, but first would come tragedy, the kind of tragedy that tests not just a man's courage, but his character. Let your breathing deepen as we move forward in time, to a moment when the course of history balanced on the edge of a sword. The year was 336 BCE, and the air in the theater of Aegae was thick with the scent of incense and the murmur of celebration. King Philip II of Macedon was at the height of his power, preparing to launch an invasion of Persia that would unite all of Greece under Macedonian leadership. But fate, as the ancient Greeks well knew, has a way of humbling even the mightiest of mortals. In the shadowed corridors of the theater, a man named Pausanias moved with purpose and desperation. He had been Philip's bodyguard, trusted with the king's very life, but personal grievances and court intrigues had twisted his loyalty into something dark and dangerous. As Philip entered the theater, resplendent in royal robes and basking in the adulation of his subjects, Pausanias struck. The assassination was swift and brutal. Philip II, the man who had unified Macedonia and brought Greece to heel, lay dying on the stones of Aegae while chaos erupted around him. In that moment of horror and confusion, with nobles shouting orders and soldiers running in all directions, 20-year-old Alexander found himself thrust into a role he had prepared for all his life, yet perhaps never truly believed would come so soon. Picture the young prince, his face pale but his jaw set with determination, standing over his father's body while the kingdom he was meant to inherit threatened to crumble around him. The enemies of Macedonia, both within and without, saw opportunity in the king's death. Who was this boy, after all, to claim the throne of such a mighty kingdom? He had proven himself in minor campaigns, yes, but was he truly ready to step into Philip's sandals? The answer came with a swiftness that took even Alexander's supporters by surprise. Within days of his father's death, the young king had secured the loyalty of the Macedonian army, no small feat, considering that these were hardened veterans who had followed Philip through decades of warfare. Alexander's secret lay not merely in his royal blood, but in the relationships he had carefully cultivated during his years as heir apparent. He knew his soldiers by name. He remembered their victories and honored their sacrifices. When he spoke to them of continuing his father's work, they heard not the untested words of a youth, but the voice of someone who had already proven himself worthy of their trust. The army that had been Philip's became Alexander's not through inheritance alone, but through earned respect. Yet securing the loyalty of his own troops was only the first challenge. News of Philip's death had spread like wildfire across Greece, and in every city-state, ambitious leaders saw an opportunity to throw off the Macedonian yoke. Thebes rose in rebellion, declaring that the age of Macedonian dominance was over. Athens stirred with rumors of revolt. Even in the north, barbarian tribes tested the borders, probing for weakness in the wake of the great king's death. Alexander's advisors, gray-haired men who had served his father faithfully, urged caution. Consolidate your power first, they counseled. Secure Macedonia, then perhaps in a year or two, when your rule is established, you might consider dealing with the Greeks. But Alexander had inherited more than his father's kingdom, he had inherited his dreams. The invasion of Persia, Philip's great ambition, could not wait. Every day of delay would allow the Persian Empire to prepare its defenses, to strengthen its resolve. More importantly, every show of weakness would encourage more rebellions, more challenges to Macedonian authority. And so the young king made a decision that would define his reign. He would deal with all threats simultaneously, with a speed and ruthlessness that would leave his enemies reeling. The campaign that followed was a masterpiece of military strategy and psychological warfare. Alexander moved his army south with such speed that the first most Greeks knew of his approach was the dust cloud on their horizon. At Thermopylae, the narrow pass where 300 Spartans had once held back the Persian hordes, Alexander paused just long enough to be acclaimed as hegemon, leader, of the League of Corinth, the same position his father had held. But it was at Thebes that Alexander truly announced his intentions to the world. The Theban rebels, confident in their city's mighty walls and proud military tradition, prepared for a siege. They expected negotiations, perhaps terms of surrender that would preserve their dignity while acknowledging Macedonian supremacy. Instead, Alexander gave them a lesson in the new reality of Greek politics. His assault on Thebes was swift, brutal, and total. The city that had produced some of Greece's greatest heroes was razed to the ground, its population sold into slavery, its very existence erased from the map. Of all the great buildings and monuments of Thebes, Alexander spared only one, the house where the poet Pindar had lived, honoring the man who had sung the praises of athletic heroes and noble deeds. The message was clear and terrifying: submit to Macedonia, or share Thebes's fate. The psychological impact of Thebes's destruction rippled across the Greek world like waves from a dropped stone. City after city sent embassies to Alexander, hastening to declare their loyalty to the young king who had proven himself capable of such decisive action. Athens, which had been preparing for rebellion, instead sent ambassadors bearing apologies and gifts. But even as he secured Greece through fear and diplomacy, Alexander's mind was already turning eastward, toward the vast empire that lay beyond the Hellespont. The Persian Empire of Darius III stretched from the Mediterranean to the Indus River, encompassing dozens of peoples, languages, and cultures. It was wealthy beyond imagination, powerful beyond measure, and ancient beyond memory. It was exactly the kind of challenge that had haunted Alexander's dreams since boyhood. In the winter of 334 BCE, as snow fell softly on the hills of Macedonia, Alexander made his final preparations for the great adventure. He stood in his father's study, surrounded by maps and reports from spies, calculating distances and supplies with the methodical precision Aristotle had taught him. But when he looked up from his calculations and gazed out at the snow-covered landscape of his homeland, what did he see? Perhaps he saw the face of Bucephalus, now a magnificent warhorse in his prime, eager for the campaigns ahead. Perhaps he remembered Aristotle's words about virtue and greatness. Or perhaps he simply saw the edge of the known world, calling to him like a siren's song. The ancient historian Plutarch tells us that as Alexander prepared to depart for Asia, he distributed all of his personal property among his friends and followers. When one of his companions, Perdiccas, asked what the king was keeping for himself, Alexander replied with words that would echo through history: hope. Hope, perhaps that was always Alexander's greatest weapon. Not the sarissa, the long spear that gave Macedonian infantry their advantage, nor the companion cavalry that would sweep across the battlefields of Asia like an avalanche of bronze and iron. His greatest weapon was an unshakable belief that the impossible was merely difficult, and the difficult was merely a matter of proper planning and sufficient audacity. As spring approached and the ships gathered at the harbor of Amphipolis, Alexander performed the rituals that would mark the beginning of his great adventure. He sacrificed to Zeus and to Athena, asking for their blessing on his enterprise. He poured wine into the Hellespont, honoring the spirits of the heroes who had crossed these same waters to fight at Troy centuries before. Standing on the deck of his flagship as the Macedonian fleet crossed the narrow strait between Europe and Asia, Alexander could see the coast of Troy in the distance. Here, Achilles had fought and died for glory. Here, Hector had defended his homeland against foreign invaders. Here, the Trojan War, the foundational myth of Greek culture, had played out in all its tragic grandeur. But Alexander was crossing these waters not to repeat the past, but to surpass it. The boy who had once dreamed of racing across the plains of Troy was now a king leading an army into Asia, ready to write his own legend in the annals of history. The die was cast, the river crossed. Destiny had called, and Alexander had answered. What lay ahead would test not just his courage and his strategic mind, but something deeper, his ability to remain human while achieving the impossible. Feel your muscles relax as we drift into the rhythm of marching feet and the quiet whisper of banners in the wind. The Macedonian army moved across the landscape of Asia Minor like a river of bronze and iron, 35,000 men following their young king into the unknown. The year was 334 BCE, and Alexander had just achieved his first victory on Asian soil, a cavalry engagement at the Granicus River that announced to the Persian Empire that a new player had entered their game. But it was not merely the victory that mattered, it was how Alexander fought that would define his legend. While other kings commanded from safe distances, surrounded by bodyguards and watching the battle unfold from elevated positions, Alexander led from the front. He charged with his companion cavalry, his bronze breastplate gleaming in the morning sun, his horse Bucephalus beneath him moving like liquid lightning across the battlefield. Picture that moment at the Granicus, the river running red with blood, the cries of men and horses echoing off the water, and in the midst of it all, a young king whose golden hair streamed behind him like a battle standard. Persian nobles, some of the finest warriors in the world, recognized him and pressed forward, seeking the glory that would come from killing the Macedonian upstart. Spears thrust toward him, swords sought his life, but Alexander moved through the melee with a grace that seemed almost supernatural. It was during this battle that one of the most defining moments of Alexander's career occurred. Spithridates, a Persian satrap, swung his sword in a mighty arc aimed at Alexander's head. The blow would have ended the invasion before it truly began, but Alexander's friend Clitus, called the Black for his dark hair and fierce demeanor, intercepted the strike with his own blade, saving his king's life in a moment that would bind their fates together in ways neither could foresee. After the victory, Alexander made a decision that revealed the depth of his political wisdom. Instead of treating the defeated Persian territories as conquered provinces to be plundered, he declared himself the liberator of the Greek cities that had been under Persian rule. In Sardis, the ancient capital of Lydia, he restored democratic government. In Ephesus, he returned the famous Temple of Artemis to Greek control. These were not merely tactical moves, they were part of a grander vision that saw conquest not as destruction, but as transformation. The coastal cities of Asia Minor opened their gates to him not as to a conqueror, but as to a hero. The contrast with previous invasions could not have been more stark. When the Persians conquered territory, they imposed their culture, their religion, their way of life upon the defeated. Alexander, however, seemed to understand that lasting empire could not be built on force alone. But it was at Gordium, an ancient city in the heart of Phrygia, that Alexander encountered a challenge unlike any he had faced on the battlefield. In the temple of Zeus stood an ox cart, its yoke bound to the cart by a knot of such complexity that no one had been able to untie it. Legend held that whoever could loose the Gordian knot would become master of all Asia. The knot itself was a marvel of ancient craftsmanship, made of cornel bark and tied with such intricate cunning that it was impossible to see where it began or ended. For centuries, the wisest men and strongest warriors had attempted to solve its puzzle, but all had failed. The knot had become a symbol of the impossible, a challenge that existed more in the realm of legend than reality. Alexander studied the knot in silence while his officers watched. Here was a problem that could not be solved by courage or tactical brilliance, that could not be overcome by the charge of cavalry or the precision of siege engines. The young king who had never met a challenge he could not master faced perhaps the first truly impossible task of his career. What happened next has been debated by historians for over 2 millennia. According to some accounts, Alexander drew his sword and cut the knot in half, declaring that it mattered not how it was undone, only that it was undone. Other sources suggest he found a more elegant solution, discovering the pin that held the yoke to the cart and removing it, thus allowing the knot to be slipped off without being untied. Perhaps the truth matters less than the meaning. In either version, Alexander demonstrated something profound about his approach to problems. He refused to be bound by conventional thinking. Where others saw an impossible puzzle, he saw merely an obstacle to be overcome by whatever means necessary. The boy who had once tamed Bucephalus by recognizing that the horse feared his own shadow had become a man who could see solutions where others saw only complexity. That night, as thunder rolled across the mountains and lightning illuminated the ancient city of Gordium, Alexander's soldiers whispered that Zeus himself was celebrating their king's success. The gods, it seemed, approved of this young mortal who dared to cut through the tangles of fate with such decisive action. But the true test of Alexander's greatness lay not in solving ancient puzzles, but in facing the full might of the Persian Empire in open battle. That test came at Issus, a narrow coastal plain where the geography would neutralize the Persians' numerical advantage and allow Macedonian discipline to shine. Darius III, the Persian emperor, had finally taken the field himself. No longer would Alexander face merely the provincial governors and local forces that had opposed him thus far. Darius commanded the full resources of an empire that had dominated the Middle East for 2 centuries, an army so vast that it took 3 days for it to pass through the mountain passes into the plain of Issus. The night before the battle, as the 2 armies lay encamped within sight of each other, both kings prepared in their own ways for what they knew would be a decisive encounter. Darius, surrounded by the pomp and ceremony of imperial tradition, offered sacrifices to Ahura Mazda and consulted his oracles about the battle to come. In his magnificent tent, adorned with cloth of gold and precious stones, the great king of Persia embodied the ancient majesty of his empire. Alexander's preparations were different in character but no less significant. He walked among his troops in the darkness, speaking quietly with his officers, sharing the concerns and hopes of common soldiers. This was not mere theater. Alexander genuinely knew his men, remembered their names, acknowledged their contributions. When he spoke to them of the battle to come, they heard not the distant words of a monarch, but the voice of someone who would share their dangers and their glory. The Battle of Issus began at dawn, with the crash of bronze on bronze echoing off the mountains that ringed the coastal plain. The Persian forces, despite their overwhelming numbers, found themselves constrained by the narrow battlefield. Their mighty cavalry, which had swept across the steppes of Central Asia like a force of nature, could not deploy properly in the confined space. Alexander, recognizing the opportunity, launched one of his characteristic cavalry charges directly at the center of the Persian line, where Darius himself commanded from his war chariot. The sight of the Macedonian king thundering toward him, his bronze armor gleaming like the sun itself, his spear leveled for the kill, proved too much for the Persian monarch. Darius turned his chariot and fled, abandoning his army and his family in his desperate flight. The collapse of the Persian center led to the rout of their entire force. But it was in the aftermath of victory that Alexander's true character was revealed. When his soldiers brought him to Darius's abandoned tent, expecting to find their king exulting in the luxury he had captured, they instead found him treating the Persian royal family with the respect due to fellow monarchs. Darius's mother, wife, and daughters had been captured in the Persian camp, expecting to face the usual fate of royal prisoners, humiliation, slavery, or death. Instead, Alexander assured them that they would be treated with the honor befitting their station. When Darius's mother, Sisygambes, mistook Hephaestion for Alexander, both young men were tall and handsome. Alexander gently corrected her, "He is also Alexander," meaning that his dearest friend could speak and act with royal authority. This moment of gracious victory revealed something profound about Alexander's vision. He was not conquering Persia to destroy it, but to transform it, to create something new that would blend the best of Greek and Persian civilization. The boy who had once learned from Aristotle about virtue and justice was becoming a king who could show mercy in the hour of triumph. As night fell over the battlefield of Issus, with the stars reflecting off the still-warm bronze of abandoned weapons and the gentle sound of the nearby sea washing against the shore, Alexander stood among the spoils of his greatest victory yet. In his hands he held a letter from Darius, offering terms for peace and the return of the royal family. The offer was generous: recognition of Macedonian control over all the territory already conquered, a massive ransom for the return of the royal prisoners, and a treaty of friendship between the two empires. Parmenion, Alexander's most trusted general, counseled acceptance. "If I were Alexander, I would accept these terms." Alexander's response would become legendary: "So would I, if I were Parmenion." The dance of bronze and destiny would continue. The young king who had cut the Gordian knot and defeated the great king of Persia in battle was not yet ready to stop. Beyond the horizon lay Egypt, legendary land of ancient wisdom and eternal mysteries. Beyond Egypt lay the heart of the Persian Empire itself. And beyond that, well, perhaps even Alexander did not yet know where his ambitions would finally lead him. But as he stood in the captured tent of Darius III, surrounded by treasures beyond imagination yet thinking only of the campaigns to come, one thing was certain: the world had never seen his like before, and perhaps never would again. Allow your mind to drift now across the sands of time to a land where the mysteries of eternity were carved in stone and gold. The year was 332 BCE, and Alexander's army approached the Nile Delta, that verdant triangle where Africa's greatest river meets the Mediterranean Sea. Egypt, the land of pharaohs and pyramids, of ancient wisdom and timeless monuments, lay before them like a jewel waiting to be claimed. But Egypt was not simply another province to be conquered. It was a civilization older than Greece itself, a place where gods were said to walk among mortals and where the boundary between the divine and earthly realms grew thin as morning mist. The Egyptians had watched empires rise and fall for 3 millennia while their own culture endured, as eternal as the Nile's annual flood. The Persian satrap who governed Egypt for Darius III might have expected a siege, a battle, perhaps months of warfare as the young Macedonian king fought his way up the Nile. Instead, he found something unprecedented in the annals of conquest. Alexander approached not as a destroyer, but as a liberator who sought to restore Egypt to its people. Picture the scene as Alexander's army crested the final hill before Memphis, the ancient capital. Below them spread the city in all its glory, temples rising like mountains toward the sky, the great pyramid of Giza visible in the distance, the Nile flowing like liquid silver through cultivated fields that had fed civilization since time immemorial. The sight that greeted them was not an enemy preparing for war, but a people ready to welcome new rulers who promised freedom from Persian oppression. The Persian satrap Mazak surrendered without a fight, recognizing perhaps that the winds of change were blowing too strongly to resist. But more significantly, the Egyptian priests, guardians of traditions older than Homer's songs, came forward to greet Alexander not as a foreign conqueror, but as a legitimate pharaoh sent by the gods to restore Ma'at, the ancient Egyptian concept of divine order and justice. In the great temple of Ptah at Memphis, Alexander submitted to the ancient rituals that would make him pharaoh of Egypt. The ceremony itself was a marvel to behold, priests in white linen robes chanting in a language that predated Greek civilization by centuries, incense rising like prayers toward the star-painted ceiling, and at the center of it all, a young Macedonian king accepting the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. But Alexander understood that merely wearing the pharaoh's crown was not enough. To truly rule Egypt, he needed the blessing of the most ancient and powerful god in the Egyptian pantheon, Ammon, whom the Greeks identified with their own Zeus. And so he made a decision that would have profound consequences for his life and legend. He would journey across the western desert to the oracle of Ammon at the oasis of Siwa. The journey to Siwa was perilous beyond measure. The western desert was a vast sea of sand where even experienced guides lost their way, where the sun could kill a man in hours and where sandstorms could bury entire caravans beneath moving dunes. Alexander set out with only a small party of his closest companions, leaving the main army at Memphis under Parmenian's command. For days they traveled across the trackless waste, guided by Libyan nomads who read the desert like sailors read the stars. The landscape was surreal in its harsh beauty, endless dunes that shifted color from gold to orange to deep red as the sun moved across the sky, nights so clear that the stars seemed close enough to pluck from the heavens, and a silence so profound it seemed to echo in the soul. According to the ancient accounts, the small party became lost when their guides could no longer find the way. Water ran low, hope began to fade, and even Alexander's legendary confidence was tested by the vastness of the desert. But then, as if sent by the gods themselves, a flight of ravens appeared, leading them westward toward the hidden oasis. Siwa, when it finally appeared before them like a mirage made real, was a paradise beyond imagining. Palm trees swayed in the desert breeze, cool springs bubbled up from hidden depths, and ancient temples stood among gardens that seemed impossibly lush after the sterile beauty of the desert. The priests of Ammon, who had maintained their vigil in this remote place for centuries, came forward to greet the young king with ceremonies that had been old when the pyramids were built. What happened during Alexander's private consultation with the Oracle of Ammon remains one of history's greatest mysteries. The ancient sources tell us only that he emerged from the inner sanctum of the temple with a look of profound satisfaction, declaring that he had received the answer he had hoped for. To his closest friends, he hinted that the oracle had confirmed his divine parentage, that he was not merely the son of Philip of Macedon, but the son of Zeus Ammon himself. Whether Alexander truly believed this divine confirmation or whether he recognized its political value, the effect was immediate and profound. Word spread throughout his army and beyond that their king had been acknowledged by the gods themselves as divine. For the Egyptians, this was perfectly natural. Pharaohs had always been gods in human form. For the Greeks it was more complex, but not unprecedented. Heroes like Hercules and Achilles had been born of mortal mothers and divine fathers. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Alexander's time in Egypt was not the religious ceremonies or divine confirmations, but a decision he made regarding the future of his conquests. Standing on the Mediterranean coast, where the Nile's westernmost mouth met the sea, Alexander envisioned something extraordinary, a new city that would serve as a bridge between the Greek and Egyptian worlds, a center of learning and commerce that would endure long after his armies had passed into legend. The site he chose for this new city was perfect in its strategic importance. The island of Pharos provided a natural harbor, the Nile Delta offered rich agricultural land, and the location would command the trade routes between Europe, Africa, and Asia. But Alexander's vision extended far beyond mere commercial considerations. This city, which he named Alexandria after himself, would be designed as a cosmopolitan center where Greek philosophy could meet Egyptian wisdom, where scholars from all nations could gather to expand the boundaries of human knowledge. The planning of Alexandria revealed another facet of Alexander's genius. While he could move with lightning speed when military necessity demanded it, he could also think in terms of centuries when laying the foundations for lasting achievement. He walked the proposed boundaries of the city himself, marking the future locations of temples, palaces, and the great library that would one day house the accumulated wisdom of the ancient world. The Egyptians watched these preparations with wonder and approval. Here was a conqueror unlike any they had known, one who sought not to impose his own culture upon them, but to create something new that honored both traditions. The fusion of Greek and Egyptian elements in Alexandria's planned architecture symbolized Alexander's broader vision for his empire, not a collection of subjugated provinces, but a unified realm where the best aspects of different civilizations could flourish together. As winter deepened and the time came to leave Egypt, Alexander performed one final ceremony that demonstrated his understanding of the land he was leaving behind. At the tomb of the great pharaoh Amenhotep III, he made offerings according to ancient Egyptian ritual, honoring not just the dead king but the eternal cycle of death and renewal that lay at the heart of Egyptian religion. The morning of departure was bittersweet. The Nile, which had witnessed the rise and fall of so many dynasties, reflected the early light like a mirror of gold and silver. Alexander stood on the deck of his ship as it prepared to sail northward toward the Mediterranean, looking back at the land that had welcomed him as a god and would remember him as one of its greatest pharaohs. But even as he prepared to return to the endless campaigns that awaited him in Asia, Alexandria was already beginning to rise from the marshy ground where he had traced its boundaries. The city that would bear his name would outlast his empire, would preserve the learning of the ancient world through the dark ages to come, would serve as a beacon of human achievement long after the last Macedonian soldier had returned to dust. In Egypt, Alexander had learned something profound about the nature of conquest and rulership. It was not enough to defeat one's enemies in battle. True victory required the ability to win their hearts, to convince them that the new order was not just preferable to the old, but divinely ordained. The boy who had once dreamed of emulating Achilles was becoming something greater, a king who could unite disparate peoples under a single vision of greatness. As his ships sailed northward toward Syria and the resumption of war with Darius, Alexander carried with him more than just the title of Pharaoh and the blessing of Ammon. He carried a deeper understanding of his own destiny and the knowledge that true immortality lay not in the span of years a man might live, but in the legacy he could create for future generations. The sands of Egypt would remember his footsteps long after the last echo of his voice had faded into silence. And in the great library of Alexandria, yet to be built but already taking shape in his imagination, the wisdom of ages would find a home where it could flourish and grow, a gift from the young king to all humanity. Let your breathing grow deeper now as we journey into the heart of empire, where the fate of continents would be decided by the clash of bronze and iron, strategy and courage. The year was 331 BCE, and somewhere in the vast expanse of Mesopotamia, two armies moved like storm clouds toward an inevitable collision that would reshape the ancient world. Darius III had learned from his defeats. No longer would he allow geography to constrain his forces or Alexander's speed to dictate the terms of engagement. This time, the Persian emperor had chosen his ground carefully, a vast plain near the village of Gaugamela, where his numerical superiority could be brought to bear and his feared scythed chariots could operate effectively. For months, Persian engineers had worked to prepare the battlefield, smoothing the ground for cavalry charges and removing obstacles that might impede their formations. An army of over 200,000 men had assembled from across the empire, Persians and Medes, Bactrians from the steppes of Central Asia, Indian war elephants with their mahouts, and Greek mercenaries who fought for gold rather than glory. Alexander approached this challenge with characteristic thoroughness. His army, now seasoned by years of campaigning and supplemented by allied forces from across the eastern Mediterranean, numbered perhaps 47,000 men, a David facing down Goliath on an epic scale. But if the numbers favored Darius, the quality of leadership and the cohesion of purpose belonged entirely to the Macedonians. The night before the battle, both armies lay encamped within sight of each other, their campfires creating twin galaxies of light on the dark plain. In the Persian camp, Darius consulted his advisors and made final preparations for what he hoped would be the decisive victory that would drive the Macedonian invaders back across the Hellespont. The weight of empire rested on his shoulders, not just his own reign, but the 2-century legacy of Persian dominance in the Middle East. In the Macedonian camp, the mood was different but no less intense. Alexander moved among his troops as he had done before every major engagement, sharing their concerns, acknowledging their fears, reminding them of previous victories. These men had followed him from the banks of the Granicus to the sands of Egypt, had seen him lead from the front in every battle, had witnessed his mercy to the defeated and his generosity to the loyal. Parmenion, Alexander's most experienced general, approached his king with concerns that reflected the pragmatic wisdom of age. "The enemy numbers are overwhelming," he warned. "Perhaps we should attack at night, when darkness might help offset their advantage in numbers. Alexander's response revealed both his confidence and his understanding of what this battle truly meant. I will not steal victory like a thief. Alexander must defeat Darius openly, so that all the world may know which of us the gods favor. This was more than mere bravado. Alexander understood that Gaugamela would be remembered as the moment when the fate of the Persian Empire was decided. A victory won through stealth might be tactically sound, but it would not carry the psychological weight necessary to convince the diverse peoples of the Persian Empire that a new order had truly arrived. As dawn broke over the plain of Gaugamela, both armies deployed in formations that reflected their respective strengths and strategies. Darius placed his scythed chariots in front, backed by his elite immortals and flanked by massive formations of cavalry. His plan was straightforward: punch through the Macedonian center with an overwhelming charge while his superior numbers on the flanks enveloped Alexander's smaller force. Alexander's deployment was more complex, reflecting both necessity and genius. His famous companion cavalry anchored the right wing, with Alexander himself at their head. The center consisted of his Macedonian phalanx, their 18-foot sarissas bristling like a forest of steel. On the left, Parmenion commanded a mixed force designed to refuse battle while the decisive action developed elsewhere. But perhaps Alexander's most innovative tactical decision was his use of reserves, formations held back from the initial deployment, ready to respond to threats or exploit opportunities as they developed. This flexibility would prove crucial as the battle unfolded in ways neither commander had fully anticipated. The clash, when it came, was apocalyptic in its violence and scope. The Persian scythed chariots thundered forward, their wheel blades designed to cut through infantry formations like knives through grain. But the Macedonians had prepared for this threat, opening lanes in their formation that allowed the chariots to pass through harmlessly before being destroyed by javelin-armed light troops. What followed was perhaps the most complex and decisive battle of the ancient world. Persian cavalry swept around the Macedonian flanks, threatening to envelop the entire army. In the center, the clash of the phalanx against Persian infantry created a sound like continuous thunder. And through it all, Alexander watched and waited for the moment when his tactical genius could be unleashed. That moment came when a gap opened in the Persian center as units were drawn off to support the flanking attacks. Alexander, his bronze armor gleaming in the morning sun, his spear lowered for the charge, led his companion cavalry directly at this weak point. The wedge formation he had perfected, with himself at the tip, drove into the Persian line like a thunderbolt thrown by Zeus himself. The psychological impact of seeing Alexander personally leading the charge was enormous. Persian soldiers who might have stood firm against anonymous attackers broke and fled when they saw the young king bearing down on them, his golden hair streaming behind him like a battle standard. The collapse of the center began slowly, then accelerated as panic spread through the Persian ranks. Darius, watching his carefully planned battle dissolve into chaos, faced the same terrible choice he had confronted at Issus. Stand and fight, likely dying in the process, or flee and preserve the possibility of future resistance. Once again, the Persian emperor chose survival over glory, turning his chariot toward the east and abandoning his army to its fate. The pursuit that followed was merciless but selective. Alexander's forces struck particularly hard at units that had been identified as elite formations, ensuring that Darius would not be able to quickly rebuild his military strength. But toward ordinary soldiers who surrendered, the Macedonians showed the restraint that had become characteristic of Alexander's campaigns. By evening, the battlefield of Gaugamela lay silent except for the moans of the wounded and the cries of scavengers. The Persian Empire, which had dominated the Middle East since the time of Cyrus the Great, lay in ruins. From the Aegean Sea to the Indus River, no force remained that could seriously challenge Macedonian supremacy. But victory at Gaugamela was more than just a military triumph. It was the moment when Alexander's vision of empire began to crystallize into reality. In the captured Persian camp, amid treasures that exceeded even those found at Issus, Alexander made decisions that would define the character of his rule for the remainder of his life. Rather than treating the Persian Empire as conquered territory to be stripped and abandoned, he began the process of transformation that would create something genuinely new in human history, a cosmopolitan empire where Greek and Persian, Egyptian and Macedonian could find common cause under enlightened leadership. The Persian administrators who surrendered were not executed or exiled, but invited to continue their service under new management. Persian religious practices were not only tolerated but actively supported. Most significantly, Alexander began to adopt elements of Persian royal ceremony, recognizing that effective rule over such a diverse empire would require symbols and rituals that all subjects could understand and respect. This policy was not without its critics, even among Alexander's own men. Many Macedonians had joined the expedition expecting to loot the Persian Empire and return home rich. The idea that they might be expected to remain permanently in Asia, adopting foreign customs and integrating with former enemies, struck some as a betrayal of everything they had fought for. But Alexander's vision was larger than the narrow expectations of his followers. Standing among the ruins of Persian power at Gaugamela, looking out over an empire that stretched beyond the horizon, he saw not just conquest but the possibility of synthesis, a new form of human civilization that could incorporate the best elements of all the cultures he had encountered. The boy who had once listened to Aristotle's lectures about virtue and justice in a peaceful grove was now a king whose decisions would affect millions of people across 3 continents. The weight of that responsibility, the magnitude of the opportunities and challenges it presented, would test not just his tactical brilliance or personal courage, but his fundamental character as a human being. As night fell over Gaugamela and the campfires of the Macedonian army twinkled like earthbound stars, Alexander stood at the threshold of a new phase of his adventure. Behind him lay the familiar world of Greece and the Mediterranean. Ahead lay the heart of Asia, Babylon and Persepolis, Samarkand and the Indies, realms so distant and exotic that they existed more in legend than in geographical reality. The storm had passed, the battle was won, but the true test of Alexander's greatness was only beginning. Allow your consciousness to drift now beyond the boundaries of the familiar world, into realms where legend and reality intertwine like lovers in an eternal dance. The year was 327 BCE, and Alexander's army moved through landscapes that existed at the very edge of the known world, pursuing a vision that had grown beyond conquest into something approaching madness, or perhaps divine inspiration. The great cities of the Persian heartland lay behind them now, Babylon with its hanging gardens, Persepolis with its magnificent palaces reduced to ash and memory, Ecbatana where the mountain air carried the scent of snow from peaks that touched the sky. Each victory had brought new challenges, new territories to govern, new peoples to understand and incorporate into the growing empire. But Alexander's appetite for the horizon had not been satisfied by these triumphs. Beyond the Hindu Kush mountains, beyond the rivers whose names were whispered in Greek campfires like incantations, Oxus, Jaxartes, Indus, lay India, the fabled land of elephants and philosophers, of riches beyond imagination and mysteries deeper than the oracle at Delphi. Picture the scene as the Macedonian army crossed the Indus River, their bronze armor glinting in the harsh sunlight of the Punjab. These were no longer the fresh-faced youths who had crossed the Hellespont 8 years earlier. They were veterans now, weathered by countless campaigns, their faces marked by sun and wind and 1,000 small scars that come from a lifetime of warfare. Their king, too, had changed. Alexander was now 29 years old, his body bearing the accumulated damage of years at war, a shoulder that never fully healed from a wound taken in India, a limp from an arrow that had pierced his ankle, scars that mapped his campaigns like a living chronicle of conquest. But his eyes still held that peculiar intensity that had marked him from childhood, the look of a man who could see possibilities invisible to others. The campaigns in India were unlike anything the Macedonians had experienced. The climate was punishing, monsoons that turned rivers into raging torrents, heat that could kill a man in armor, humidity that made every breath an effort. The enemies they faced were different too, war elephants that towered above the battlefield like moving mountains, cavalry that struck and vanished like desert winds, and kings who commanded resources that dwarfed even the Persian Empire. It was against one such king, Porus, that Alexander fought perhaps his most challenging battle at the Hydaspes River. Porus stood 7 feet tall, a giant among men, and commanded an army that included 200 war elephants, creatures that represented the ultimate fusion of nature's power and human military genius. The sight of these massive animals, their tusks gleaming like ivory spears, their mahouts directing them with the skill of master craftsmen, must have seemed to the Greeks like something from the realm of myth. The battle itself was a masterpiece of adaptation and innovation. Alexander, faced with enemies and tactics unlike any he had encountered, demonstrated once again his greatest gift, the ability to learn and evolve. He used the monsoon rains and swollen rivers to his advantage, crossing the Hydaspes at an unexpected point while Porus was distracted by diversionary forces. But it was after the victory that Alexander's true character shone brightest. When Porus was brought before him as a prisoner, bloodied but unbowed, Alexander asked how he expected to be treated. Porus's answer, like a king, so impressed Alexander that he not only restored the Indian ruler to his throne but expanded his territories as well. This was more than magnanimity, it was a recognition that true empire could not be built on humiliation and fear alone. Yet even as Alexander achieved victory after victory in India, a different kind of battle was being fought within his own army. The Macedonian soldiers, so far from home that their native mountains existed now only in memory and dreams, began to question not just the wisdom of continued advance, but their king's very sanity. They had followed him beyond the edges of the maps, beyond the pillars that ancient explorers had set up to mark the boundaries of the known world. They had fought enemies that their fathers could never have imagined, had seen wonders that would sound like lies when recounted in the taverns of Pella. But now Alexander spoke of pressing on to the Ganges, of reaching the eastern sea that Aristotle had taught might be the end of the inhabited world. The crisis came at the Hyphasis River, where Alexander announced his intention to continue eastward toward the Ganges and whatever lay beyond. For the first time in his career, the king who had never known defeat faced rebellion from his own men. It was not the dramatic mutiny of fiction, with drawn swords and shouted challenges, but something more subtle and perhaps more devastating, the quiet refusal of exhausted men who had simply reached their limit. Caenis, One of Alexander's most trusted officers and a veteran of every campaign since the crossing of the Hellespont, spoke for the army with words that carried the weight of accumulated sorrow. "Sir, if there is one thing above all others a successful man should know, it is when to stop. For you, with all you have achieved, that time has come." The speech that followed was heartbreaking in its honesty. These men had given their youth, their health, their comrades to Alexander's vision. They had seen the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean, had stood in the ruins of empires and watched new cities rise from empty plains. But they were mortal, and mortality has its limits. Alexander's response revealed the depth of his isolation and the magnitude of his ambition. He spoke of the shame of turning back when victory was within reach, of the glory that awaited those brave enough to see their mission to its completion. But for perhaps the first time in his life, his words failed to move his audience. The men who had followed him to the ends of the earth had finally found a boundary they would not cross. For 3 days, Alexander remained in his tent, hoping that his soldiers would reconsider, that their love for him would overcome their exhaustion and homesickness. But when he finally emerged and announced that they would turn back, the cheers that greeted his words told him everything he needed to know about his men's true feelings. The return journey was marked by a mixture of triumph and tragedy that reflected the complex nature of Alexander's achievement. There were victories still to be won: the siege of the Malian city where Alexander himself stormed the walls and was nearly killed by an arrow that pierced his lung. There were new peoples to encounter, new alliances to forge, new problems of administration and governance to solve. But there was also a growing sense that something had changed, that the perfect unity of purpose that had carried the army from Macedonia to India was beginning to fracture. The death of Hephaestion, Alexander's closest friend and perhaps the only person who truly understood his vision, marked a turning point from which the great king never fully recovered. By 323 BCE, Alexander had returned to Babylon, that ancient city where empires had been born and buried for millennia. Here, surrounded by the grandeur of Mesopotamian civilization, he planned new campaigns, to Arabia, perhaps to the western Mediterranean, possibly even to the unknown lands beyond the Atlantic. The boy who had wept because there were no more worlds to conquer had found new worlds to dream of conquering. But fate, as the Greeks understood better than any people, has its own timeline. On a June evening in Babylon, after a banquet where wine flowed like water and the laughter of companions echoed off ancient walls, Alexander fell ill with a fever that would prove to be his last enemy. The end, when it came, was swift but not unexpected. Alexander had pushed his body and spirit to limits that would have broken lesser men. As he lay dying in the great palace of Nebuchadnezzar, his generals gathered around him, asking to whom he would leave his empire. His answer, to the strongest, was vintage Alexander, cryptic, challenging, and guaranteed to create exactly the kind of competition that had driven his own rise to greatness. He had conquered the known world, but he could not conquer time itself. Alexander died as he had lived, surrounded by mystery and legend, his final words debated by historians, his ultimate intentions known only to himself. He was 32 years old, an age when most men are just beginning to understand their own potential. Yet in his brief life, he had reshaped civilization, created an empire that stretched from Egypt to India, and left a legacy that would influence human development for millennia to come. As the sun set over Babylon on that June evening in 323 BCE, the greatest adventure in human history came to an end. But the ideas Alexander had planted, the vision of a world where different cultures could merge and flourish together, where human potential knew no boundaries, where courage and wisdom could overcome any obstacle. These ideas would outlive bronze and marble, would survive the fall of empires and the passage of centuries. The boy who had once tamed a horse by recognizing its fear had become a man who taught humanity to overcome its own fears of the unknown. His empire fragmented within years of his death, but the world he created, cosmopolitan, interconnected, unafraid of difference, remains his true monument. Sleep now, and dream of horizons yet to be discovered, of challenges yet to be met, of the endless human capacity to reach beyond the possible into the realm of the miraculous. For in the end, that was Alexander's greatest gift to posterity, not the cities that bore his name or the territories he conquered, but the simple, revolutionary idea that no dream is too large if we have the courage to pursue it to the very edge of the world.